everyone. My name is Kate, and I work at 1804 Books, a community bookstore and press for socialist literature and revolutionary theory for curious people everywhere. We're based at the People's Forum, which is in New York City. We're a movement incubator for working class organizations and communities, and we have a wide breadth of classes. We've got an Earth Day teaching coming up, also a vendor's market if you're in town this Saturday, next Saturday. And then we also have an art space, tons of concerts, of course, tons of book talks, a cafe, and also many of our offerings are both virtual and in person. So wherever you are, if you're in New York or if you're in the country or if you're somewhere else in the world, feel free to follow us on all of our social media and join us and see what we're up to. Today's book talk is on Encountering Education by organizer and political and educational theorist Derek Ford. He actually taught a class with us at the People's Forum, which is really exciting. And yeah, his book is particularly resonant with us at the People's Forum because we're a political education space. So we're always asking questions about how we can create alternative pedagogical approaches that actually fuel us as critical and curious human beings and help build class consciousness instead of the current educational models that imprint us with the same ideological beliefs as the ruling class. We're also excited to be presenting today's book talk with the publisher of Encountering Education, Iskra Books, the publishing arm of Peace, Land, and Bread magazine. And we want to thank our comrades there who helped make this book and this event possible. Of course, you can buy the book at 1804 Books or at Iskra Books. I'll hand it over to Ben to do more thorough introductions about Iskra, the book, and the speakers joining us today. So yeah, without further ado, I'll pass it over to Ben.
Well, hello, friends and comrades. Thank you so much for joining us today for our book launch and panel talk for one of our most recent releases here at Iskra Books. It's Derek Ford's Encountering Education, Elements for Marxist Pedagogy. I'm Ben Stonke, and I'm the publisher here at Iskra Books. I'm a PhD candidate of political ecology in the Department of Environmental Studies at Antioch University. And I also teach in the humanities department over at Central State University. So I'm joined today by Nate Reed, a professional educator and managing editor of our journal Peace, Land, and Bread, who along with myself and Ember Kelly are the co-directors of our larger educational project, the Center for Communist Studies. So I'd like to start this by saying thank you so much to Kate for all your support and hospitality in hosting this and for all your work in helping to set this up. And also a big thank you to our friends and comrades over at 1804 Books and the People's Forum who've graciously agreed to host this event, as well as to all of our panelists for agreeing to show up and talk with us today. So we here at Iskra, we're incredibly psyched about the release of this book for a number of reasons, one of which being that Derek is just such a brilliant and groundbreaking theorist. We're ultimately just honored to publish this really important and poignant piece of educational philosophy, which in my opinion just has so much to offer the movement more generally, of revolutionary education, pedagogy, and organizing. I'd like to begin briefly by introducing the topic of the day, that's Derek's book, and then our speakers, and then I'd like to let them do the really important work here, and hopefully all of the heavy lifting, which is talking both about the book and about their own thoughts and reflections on the book. So we're just here for an hour today, so if we have time at the end, Nate and I have given this book another thorough read through and can ask some questions to help move us along and to hopefully go deeper into the book's content. So without much further ado, right, Encountering Education, Elements for a Marxist Pedagogy is a book that the esteemed Peter McLaren has recently called, and I quote here, an incisive intervention in the fields of educational and political theory, and also one that is relevant to organizers and activists today. Encountering Education is a book in which Derek develops new Marxist pedagogical elements to advance the class struggle. Derek argues that the entire Marxist project of establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat and creating a classless society entails an educational praxis that builds up disinterpellative encounters. So through an inventive reading of Marx, Althusser, Glissant, and others, they advance two dialectical pedagogical processes in the book, inquiry and presentation, developing both and then the political relations between the two through a range of theorists and situations. Encountering Education both illuminates the historical, political, spatial, technological, and sonic conditions of our own struggle, and it also assembles new pedagogical forms of reading, writing, listening, and learning through which we can encounter and realize an alternative social formation, and through the guidance of the party, a new mode of production. So now a bit about our speakers and esteemed panelists here. So of course we have Derek R. Ford, who is an assistant professor of education studies at DePauw University and an instructor with the People's Forum. They've published 8 monographs, the latest of which are Marxism, Pedagogy, and the General Intellect Beyond the Knowledge Economy, and then In Human Educations, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Pedagogy and Thought, both in 2021, so quite prolific. In addition to running 3 book series, Ford is associate editor of Post-Digital Science and Education and deputy editor of Journal for Critical Education Policy Studies. Ford's an organizer with the Answer Coalition, a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and the education chair at the Hampton Institute, as well as the editor for Liberation School. Their popular writing has appeared in Monthly Review, Black Agenda Report, and elsewhere. And he's also hosted the incredible podcast series of which we're a big fan, Reading Capital with Comrades. We're also joined today by Nazia Kazi, who is an anthropologist and educator based in Philadelphia. Her work explores the role of Islamophobia and racism in the context of global politics. She's lived in Dubai, New York City, and the Chicagoland area, which is where Nate and I join you from today. She's an associate professor of anthropology at Stockton University in New Jersey, where she teaches courses on race, ethnicity, immigration, and Islam in the US. And she's the author of Islamophobia, Race, and Global Politics, which is out now in an expanded 2nd edition from Rowman and Littlefield. We're also joined by Jason Wozniak, an assistant professor of educational foundations and policy studies at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. Jason's published widely in both North and South America, and he's completing his first book at the moment, provisionally titled The Miseducation of the Indebted Student. In addition, Jason is the founder and co-director of the Latin American Philosophy and Education Society. And for the past 2 years, Jason has been one of the lead researchers on Hacer Escuela, Inventing School, Rethinking the Pedagogy of Critical Theory, which is a sub-project of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant, Critical Theory in the Global South. And finally, we're joined by Kym Smith, who is an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, an outside liaison with Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, and co-founder of the Soda City Bail Fund. She's also a mom to an amazing kid, a needy pit bull, and a self-absorbed cat. So you can learn more about Kym on episode 6 of From Struggle to Militant, a Revolutionary Story by Breaking the Chains magazine. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you, Derek.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you, Kate. Thanks all the comments for coming, and everybody for watching. It really means a lot to me. Really, I wrote the book with the hope that it could contribute something to the educational project of the left. In general, I'm interested in what is particularly what are the particular pedagogical processes or logics or practices involved in both the reproduction of capitalism and movements against capitalism and the production of different societies. Because generally you find educational terms like studying and testing and learning in political theory and in Marxist theory, but they're never really articulated, right? And so in a sense, they're kind of just like equated or subsumed under politics. And then in a lot of educational literature, either education is merely a means of like producing the right kind of people to participate in struggle, or there's not really an analysis of anything pedagogical. It's just like, an anti-neoliberal critique of schooling systems. So I'm interested in like, if capital and all social formations run on educational logics, what are those logics? What alternative logics are there? And, pedagogy has been a centrally important question in the Marxist tradition. It's one that I think was most explicitly really introduced with Lukasz's work. And this is what Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed was actually responding to, was Lukasz's developments on Marx. And Marx, he talks about education sometimes, but, never really about pedagogy. One place it shows up obliquely is in his foreword to the French edition of Capital, in which was published in serial format. And he said, basically was writing the publisher, this is a good decision, but, I fear that people are going to be eager for the conclusions. They're going to get stuck in the first 3 chapters and, they're going to get impatient. And so he says, all I can say is that like, it takes a lot of courage and endurance to, climb the luminous summits of science or whatever. And so in a sense, then he raises this pedagogical problematic, but then says, well, okay, it's up to workers and people themselves to figure it out. But then when I was teaching the book when I was teaching the book recently, I noticed that I think it's in the forward to the second German edition, where he's talking about his use of the dialectic, Marx makes an important distinction between the method of inquiry and the method of presentation, noting that, you know, when you present something, it looks as if it was already sort of there, assembled in the world beforehand, and you just figured it out. Whereas, you know, the method of inquiry is a much more open-ended process. You know, the method of presentation proceeds linearly and sort of developmentally, right? Here's a building block, here's, you know, the next building block, here's complications to them, right? And it sort of culminates in, you know, the general law of capitalist accumulation, or the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. And the method of inquiry is much different, because it's basically like the process of studying, right? When you study something, you're not sure, you know, initially you have an end in sight, but quickly that end is sort of suspended, and you might take a totally different route. You know, you go down dead ends, you wind up taking all these different detours that aren't really distractions, but are actually essential to the process of research. And I actually think, and so this is something I developed in a Liberation School article, a shorter one a couple of years ago, and I've been sort of just kind of stuck with this because I think Marx is articulating two different pedagogies that are internal to Marx's own theory and theoretical development and form of presentation. And so I base it, as Peter McLaren wrote in a recent interview, like the book is basically like kind of another riff on that. And in particular, I'm interested in how these two pedagogies are blocked together, how they show up in Marx's own work, and then I want to basically extend them in other ways, right? So actually, and Peter McLaren, one of his earliest works, Schooling as Ritual Performance, first published in 1986, before he was a Marxist, talks about gestures, the importance of gestures, and in later editions, he sort of revised it to connect those gestures to political economy. And so I'd like to basically relay these two pedagogies with two different kinds of gestures that we and other students perform, right, in educational processes. The first gesture is kind of like the, oh, okay, I get it, right? Like everything's sort of clicking, right? The light bulb thing, right? And the nodding of the head, for example, right, as you're sort of, you know, presenting these building blocks. The other gestures and facial expressions in particular that I'm really interested in is, one, there's the gesture of like total like confusion, right? Like, wait, what's happening, right? Like the ground has been swept off from under you. And the other one is this gesture of like wonder, where basically like, oh shit, I never thought about that before. The world could be totally different. So for example, I was recently listening to a new episode of the Socialist Program that's on the Liberation News YouTube that Brian Becker is contextualizing state and revolution. And in it, he says that, you know, towards the end of 1916, Lenin was speaking to a group of students when he was in exile. And he said, you know, I don't think a revolution is going to happen in my time, but I'm going to organize so it can happen in yours. And, you know, a year later, he was head of the new revolutionary government. So, for example, like that's something that, you know, allows me to open up to a sense of possibility that things can be radically otherwise than they are. You know, it's hard to do this for us because we've really been trained, those of us in the United States in particular, have been trained in an educational system of like testing, and there's right or wrong answers, and, you know, like what's the answer, right? What's the right answer? And the project I'm working on now is kind of extended from this, but this is based on Gabriel Rockhill and Jennifer Ponce de Leon's work on aesthetics and politics, in which they importantly show that capitalism, you know, and capitalist ideology isn't just about our ideas, but it's about our senses, right? Like what we sense and how we sense. And so it's not merely enough to tell people what's wrong with capitalism, right? We also have to produce sort of experiences for people that can basically help us sense the actuality of revolution, that there's alternatives that are you know, present and that are possible and realizable in the future. And so in this book, one of the ways that I do that is through building on Tyson Lewis's notion of disinterpellation, which is a riff on Althusser's interpellation. So basically the ways in which were interpolated as capitalist subjects, not just through ideas, but through actual material practices. And disinterpellation is something that is basically the questioning of that capitalist subjectivity, right? So it makes us unfamiliar to ourselves. And so it opens the capitalist subject up to our own dissolution through an encounter with something, right? And encounters are how social formations change. There's never like a clean and fast break between, modes of production or social formations, right? And again, social formations include multiple modes of production. Marx makes this very clear in the first sentences of Capital Volume 1, also in the first preface, the first forward. And because, for example, capitalism, right, like was, emerged and collapsed several times before it actually took hold. And so, it's the notion that Marx presents this sort of stagist, linear, progressive trajectory of time and history that's universal is, it's 100% false. And Harry Eretunian's book, Marx Beyond Marx, really focuses on that. So history doesn't proceed according to a logic or a linear trajectory or toward a predefined end. And this is the pedagogical task, and that what organized the book is basically how education can facilitate encounters that can open our minds, bodies, sensations up to the actuality of revolution, right? To the ability, the necessity, the possibility of working in oppressed peoples to not only rise up, but to actually take power into our own hands and to fundamentally reorganize society in our own interests. And so I do this in different ways. I mean, I try to translate some more difficult theorists from beyond and even kind of antagonistic to the Marxist tradition. There's still some difficulty in this, but this is kind of part of the pedagogy of the book, because if it's like completely simple, completely clear, completely linear, then sort of, I'm presenting this pedagogical dialectic only using one of those logics, right? And so the book doesn't really have like sort of a neat conclusion that ties everything together, for example. I really want to try to initiate a state of wonder. And that's actually why I like reading some difficult philosophers, because, I have to really grapple with it and I never really know what they say, right? It's never like 100% clear. So the book then looks at these two pedagogies relative to colonialism, the post-digital, the urban or urbanism, and the sonic, and the relationship between colonialism, anti-colonialism, and music. So I think I'll stop there if that's okay, and we can turn to Nazia. That sound good?
Thank you so much. And it's great to be here participating in this discussion. Apologies in advance if either of my loud dogs decide to join in the conversation. So it's always a treat for me to sort of step outside of my own disciplinary silo. I'm an anthropologist. And in today's case, to consider this work, Derek's work, a treatment of sort of pedagogical logics, their context, and ultimately their disruptive potential. Specifically, it becomes clear that in this book, Ford does some really important work to bridge a gap between Marxist philosophy and Marxist pedagogy, and does this by focusing on some persistent themes. For instance, and most striking to me as I read it, the nature and emergence of openness in knowledge production. So openness, for instance, where Ford writes, a Marxist teaching of errant literacy is a paradoxical pursuit in which teachers and students suspend the activity of comparing and grasping in order to become open to the invasion of nuances. So, fortuitously, I read this book at the same time as I was reading a book about the history of communism in Urdu language poetry. And I say this was fortuitous because I saw echoes of Ford's treatment of knowledge, space, sounds, and openness in the words of partition era or colonial era South Asian poets. And so I'll try to weave those reflections into my comments today when possible. So openness appears early on in the text, where Ford carefully explains the distinction between inquiry and presentation, the way in which study carries potential for opening up new worlds and new ways of knowing. Even the move from hearing to listening is then a process of expansiveness, of opening. Writes Ford, it is only after learning to read a text that one can study it. Meanwhile, studying leaves traces in the product of learning. Both learning and studying are heterogeneously blocked together. The task of Marxist education is to facilitate movement between the two. Ford underscores the ways in which pedagogical approaches are central to capitalist modes of production, but they are also equally crucial to the counter-hegemon, bound up in the world-making that must define workers' struggles. Here is Kaifi, the poet on knowledge. He writes, ever since science has become the slave of capital, knowledge has proven untrustworthy, and the snake has found life. I find Ford's most powerful reminder in this text to be about the very nature of knowledge itself. They write, knowledge does not operate according to the logic of scarcity. Knowledge does not obey the same laws of scarcity or rivalry as physical commodities. One person's knowledge does not eliminate the possibility of another person's knowledge, except through capitalist enclosure and expropriation. Because it's hard to draw boundaries around knowledge and designate it as a commodity, it's also difficult to prevent people from accessing knowledge. So I'm reminded of, for instance, Braverman's treatises on the systematic and repetitive debraining of labor for the purposes of monopoly capital, or how on either side of the Atlantic, literacy and access to it was desperately legislated in order to squash Irish or African slave rebellions. The inherent non-scarcity of knowledge has prompted frantic attempts by the very seats of power to fabricate a scarcity where there is none. The poet Iqbal has a remarkable series in which Lenin encounters God. Lenin, confronted by a God he cannot fully understand or justify, says to God, whose God are you? Of the same ones who live under the sky? For as far as I could tell, the gods of the East are the foreigners of the West, while the West prays only to the shining dollar. The appropriators of wealth, power, and knowledge exploit the poor while preaching equality. You may be powerful and just, but in your world, bitter are the lives of the slaves of labor. Angels are witnessing this encounter at the time that Lenin is talking to Allah. And the angels interrupt this conversation and they say to God, intellect is unreined, love is unmoored, and God, your design is still incomplete. And it is only in this moment when the angels invoke intellect that God forces his people, his creation, to rise and rattle the palaces of the rich. So again, it was really lucky to read both of these texts side by side, especially with the interjections that Ford makes around, decolonial analysis and knowledge production. And so in this text, I think what Ford is offering us here is an outline of the sort of dynamism of knowledge in all contexts. And I really can't wait to see what the rest of today's discussion brings. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think I'll just wait for all the panelists and then I can respond. So next up is Jason Wozniak.
Hey, everybody. First off, it's a pleasure to be here. Derek has, in many years, we've known each other, taught me quite a bit, and I've always been a big fan of his work. Been able to read it and meet on the different stages of life. So much appreciation and thank you for the invite. If I end up coughing a bunch, it's because I'm getting over COVID right now. That's a slow process. But I'm going to make some very simple points and then try and give an example maybe of what some of the pedagogy might look like, drawing on the work that I do with a group called the Death Collective. I'm responsible for organizing a lot of political education for that group across the country and in Philadelphia. So again, these are some simple points that I drew from the book, and I think that have already been alluded to in different ways. But the first thing to note is to say that, as Derek shows, the mode of production produces a mode of subjectivity. Okay, so why is that important from the pedagogical educational standpoint? Is because how we produce our pedagogies has an influence over how we produce subjectivities in the pedagogical process. So in and through, and I think Derek alluded to this already, but in and through the educational experience, the social relation that's formed, and this is formed, you might say, in the pedagogical relation, has an enormous influence on the subjectivities that come to be. To emphasize just another point about this, I think we're often focusing on the content of what we're teaching, and I really appreciate in this book in particular the emphasis on the form, how we teach, not necessarily what we teach. Obviously, both are important, but I feel that this book really draws out the social relation aspect of educational experience. So along those lines, as we know, capitalists aren't necessarily born; they have to be produced, and in the same way, to produce the anti-capitalist, you need some sort of processes. And again, this takes place for Derek in the process of pedagogy, what he's calling a Marxist pedagogy. And so there's a lot at stake in how we go about teaching what we teach. And I really appreciate the efforts that Derek's making here to say Marx has something to say about the pedagogical process, not just about the institutions of education. And I think a lot of Marxist scholars will focus on the ways, obviously all Althusser and ideological state apparatuses or Bowles and Gintis and so on and so forth. But oftentimes in those same writings from Marxist scholars, and obviously there's differences, right? We lose sight of this process that Derek is telling us and really trying to give us a clue into okay, what would Marx, how can we draw on Marx to reshape pedagogy? So I think that's one of the most important aspects of the book as well. It's already been brought up, but the backbone of this book to me is this difference between learning and studying. And I just want to read briefly from the book because it's really wonderfully stated here. And this is on page 19. So Derek writes, learning is guided by predetermined ends, upholds binary distinctions between ignorance and intelligence, amateurism and professionalism, students and teachers, and so on. Learning is a developmental process that moves from the former to the latter by various means. It is about the actualization of pre-existing potential. He goes on to say more about that, but in contrast, you could say, studying, on the other hand, encompasses various practices that interrupt, delay, and deactivate learning. And I want to pause there just for a second because the etymology of the word learning in Latin languages, which I know better through Portuguese and Spanish, is actually really interesting. So it's aprender. And if you dig into the etymology of aprender, you start to find that it means to possess or to grasp or to accumulate. And so what Derek is saying here when he says study, on the other hand, encompasses various practices that interrupt, delay, and deactivate learning, I think what he could be saying or is saying is that we actually learn through studying ways to interrupt, delay, deactivate accumulation, grasping, and other forms of, I would argue, like expropriation and violence. Okay, so along those lines, while it would seem at moments in the book that Derek is favoring study over learning, as I think Nazia already brought up, it's definitely the case that what he's really trying to get the reader to see is that there needs to be this rhythmic sway between both study and learning. That the production of this rhythmic sway is a pedagogical practice. The production of the rhythmic sway between study and learning is a formative process. I mean, the most basic definition of education, you could say, is the process of formation. Obviously, that can be problematized, but I think it's, again, through this sway between study and learning that Derek is saying we start to develop a revolutionary subject. Both dynamic, ongoing, never finished, and marked by these moments, as it's already been mentioned, of counter-interpolation, and here he's drawing on David Backer's work, a taking up and taking on of dominant interpolations, and disinterpolation, which is coming from Tyson Lewis, which briefly stated, is the making the subject unfamiliar with herself so that she may become otherwise. I want to put this in the context now of some of the work I did, and I'll be short with this, or I do with the Debt Collective, and how this shows up in the question of indebted subjectivity. And so there's a lot of people that have been remarking on this recently. Maurizio Lazzarato perhaps is most widely known, but the feminists in Argentina, Veronica Gago and Lucy Caballero, have done really good work on this as well. And then, of course, there's all sorts of people in the US doing stuff like this. But the bottom line is that this idea that debt, financial debt, shapes subject. And what is interesting to think through if you're in a movement to abolish various types of debt is to say, well, what would it take to create both an individual and collective subject that's going to be willing and able to do that? And this turns out to be very difficult work that, there's not for no reason that there hasn't been major debt rebellions in this country for a long time. I mean, the first one was Shays Rebellion, and we could pick out others in different parts of the world. But in the United States, it's hard to find debtors' rebellions. And so obviously the production of subjectivity has been quite efficient from the standpoint of capital. So we asked the question, Debt Collective, what's the political education of, you might say, disinterpolating the indebted subject and then producing this other subject? And what ends up happening is exactly what I was talking about, where you can see in different practices where we're doing the counterinterpolative work of debt. And by that I mean that we have to combat specifically the ideologies of debt, the ethics of debt, the epistemologies of debt that are so common in the United States. So that includes guilt, shame, this notion of responsibility, calculative thinking, so on and so forth. But then there's also, of course, these moments, and I think these are moments that are, for the most part, unplanned, to be honest, of this disinterpolation, where the indebted subject that's working with us all of a sudden realizes, yeah, okay, I can be otherwise. I should be otherwise. And so what does it take to make that happen? But there's a big gamble here, and this is kind of a question that I have for Derek and other people to think through. That I don't know if I've just become cynical or, I don't know, losing hope. But the gamble, it seems, is that if we create this opening through disinterpolation in the process of, in the aspect of dealing with the indebted subject, I think we leave almost too much open. And this might come off as heavy-handed, but there is a sense where it's very clear that you can be anti-debt and pro-capitalist. And we see this all over the place. People making arguments like, well, if we abolish student debt, it's going to make it easier to buy houses, cars, and so on, and it's going to be good for the economy. What economy? The capitalist economy, right? And so I often wonder, like, is the disinterpolation of the indebted subject, where does that get us sometimes? In a sense, this is maybe a Derridian point about hospitality, where we invite what comes, and there's always that risk of what comes is going to be more dangerous than what is already here. But this is to say that I find myself in my own practice maybe abandoning a bit of the sway that I think Derek is encouraging us to do, and focusing more on the counterinterpolation and less on the disinterpolation. And so maybe Derek and others can tell me, no, you need to do both, and this is how you do it, and this is why you're doing it wrong. I don't know. That's one question. The other question I want to leave, particularly Derek, but perhaps others with, is that as I was reading this book, I did have the question of, so who or what is the pedagogue here? Because there's a ton of emphasis, obviously, on the pedagogies, but I was left wondering who or what is the pedagogue? Because I think that also matters in many different ways. And in that, we get into conversations about vanguardism. We find, there's different notions of thinking of the pedagogue, so on and so forth. And so I'm curious what the response to this question from others would be of who or what is the pedagogue that helps produce, and maybe you could argue is at least partially responsible for this way between study and learning, counterinterpolation, disinterpolation, so on and so forth. So I'll leave it there. And once again, thank you, Derek, for producing this work. I definitely learned a lot.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And just thank you to Derek for, inviting me into this space to discuss this really important book. Really excited to have this conversation. I'm not probably going to go long just because of time, and I really do want to have more conversation around the text. Just reading, I think really important to emphasize the point that I was reading this book. I came into reading this book at a point where I was kind of knees deep in my son's education. I have a 16-year-old son, and really grappling with what was needed and what was missing in his education, and just really thinking about pedagogy a lot. So I'm kind of grateful that Derek kind of just dropped this book in my lap by the time when I was grappling so hard with these ideas and thoughts. And some of the things that, you know, I think this is such an important book, and just as someone who's an organizer and, you know, and a mom and a caregiver and all these different things, I think it's really important that a book like this is for the working class and the revolutionaries, because, you know, these are the people, we're the people that really need to understand education and pedagogy in these encounters. And I just really want to talk about just a little bit of just about some of the thoughts I had. And one thing that really struck me in the parts that I kept seeing myself coming through in his work was, you know, Derek's thoughts around study and, you know, learning and study, and, you know, all those differences there and all those thoughts about it there. And just made me think about, you know, as we develop our children, as we develop, you know, cadre in our organizations, how much thought are we putting on the concept of pedagogy around study and learning, and just bringing those things to light more, and helping people understand these texts, and like just grappling with a lot of that as I read. And again, I'm gonna keep it short. So I just really wanted to just think about there's a point here, and I really also wanted to shout out how poetic I feel like Derek's book is. I don't know. It was given something. It was Baldwin or something. It was very poetic. And as a result, Marxist pedagogies of learning and studying should be seen as constellations. I just thought that was so beautiful. And then as we go through, you know, he talks so much about wonder. And so this book just left me think, you know, how do we use these constellations to, or utilize these constellations almost to create these spaces of wonder for education and learning. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Comrade. Appreciate you. So should we, yeah, let's bring Nazia and Jason back, and then I don't know, Ben and Nate, if you want to hop on too and say anything. We do have a couple minutes.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think all the questions raised would be probably a pretty great place to start. We have a couple of questions on our own. I specifically have one that might tie into Jason's, but yeah, maybe feel free to stick with the questions presented, and we can kind of go from there afterwards.
Sure, that sounds great. So yeah, thanks for like reading the work. You know, I mostly write because it's basically how I think about things. Like that's how I understand things. And I'm really happy to be able to publish now with places like Iskra, where it's actually free. You know, that's why the book is like relatively short. And why I think Iskra, you know, the People's Forum, 1804 books, Hampton Institute, everything are so crucial, because, you know, today we associate intellectualism like with the university, right? And as somebody in a university, I'll tell you that it's not a super intellectual place, and that actually, you know, like, so one of our tasks is to move intellectual production from the university to the people's movements, right? And so for those of us who are in universities, we also have to be in people's movements, and that's where our questions and our motivations emerge. And that's, you know, part of the audience that we're speaking to. And we're also sort of interpolating that audience through the writing itself, right? I will take a couple minutes to respond to all these. I mean, they were all really interesting to me. And for me, really demonstrate the importance of studying, right? And wondering and sort of alluding to things rather than, you know, posing hard and fast distinctions that might hold for all time. The openness of knowledge is definitely important, and increasingly I'm interested in the difference between knowledge and thought, right? Because, you know, knowledge is like a sort of definable, you know, definable cognition of, you know, sort of an artificially bounded thing, right? Like Marxism, right? I mean, you have to artificially bound what Marxism is in order to know it. Obviously, that's important. Knowledge is crucial, right? But it seems that in our current conjuncture, the speed and just the overall logics of capital, the subjective forces of debt, right, make it so that thought is subordinated to knowledge. And so we only think in order to produce knowledge. And really, we're not given the time to think. Thought takes time, right? And doesn't necessarily produce any results, right? And so I think that actually the other literature that you brought in, Nazia, for me, that demonstrates that thought process, right? Rather than saying like, oh, this is exactly how it relates to it, and this is a contradiction it identifies or whatever. We sort of leave it open-ended, right? And it's obviously very generative in that way. And Jason's questions, I think, are important, right? So interpolation is how we are inaugurated as capitalist subjects. Counter-interpolation is when we're inaugurated as like revolutionary subjects or oppositional subjects, right? And then disinterpellation is when we like don't even know who we are, right? And so Jason's question was about, are we leaving too much open, right? And so maybe, in his own work, he often abandons the like disinterpolative sway or swerve, and instead encourages and focuses more on counter interpolations. And I think this is a question that depends on the most fundamental sort of method of Marxism, which is the conjuncture, the conjunctional analysis, a concrete analysis of the concrete situation, right? The political determinants, the geopolitical coordinates of the struggle, what political forces are at play, the geographic context, and so on and so forth, right? And I think that, so I think it's fine. I mean, I don't think it's, I don't see a problem with I don't think there's a problem with learning or counter-interpolation at all. I mean, I often say, like, I love listening to lectures, and like nobody ever listened to like the hours-long speeches that Fidel would give and was like, oh, I really wish we had worksheets or like small group work, right? No, like I want to hear analysis, I need clear presentations, right? Slogans, right? Slogans are precise. You don't want them to be ambiguous. You want to condense politics into a few words that communicates it clearly to people. That's a place where we need like clear, explicit presentation. And so, yeah, so I mean, in a sense, I don't have an answer, but I think that the risk that you identify is one that's inherent in educational processes if they're going to be freed from the grasping drive, right? Which within the second chapter, with the help of Edward Glissant, it's basically the act of reaching out, bringing something in the world back into you. So it's like the educational logic of colonialism, really. So I'd be curious, others' thoughts on this too. And the question about who or what is a pedagogue here, right? Because I do emphasize pedagogies. I don't identify the pedagogue, which is interesting. And I mean, for me, the pedagogue is the party, or is organized through the party, because ultimately the party, the political organization, has the most, the broadest, the deepest knowledge of the conjuncture and the tactical, strategic, like procedures, right, for intervening in it. And interestingly, I think that, we also need to think about what is teaching, obviously, right? Because I mean, this is something that, teachers are seen today as just facilitators of learning, right? Like we don't have anything to offer ourselves, right? We're like, we're basically like just customer service representatives. What do you want to know? And that's not what education is, because when you get into an educational process, you might find something out that you don't want to know, that you wish you didn't know, that fundamentally changes your life, right? So that's why the professional judgment of the teacher is so crucial. And I do think we need to clarify exactly what teaching is. But I like Gert Bista's definition, where teaching is the act of bringing something from the outside into the student's life in order to sort of provoke, disrupt, the student, right? To force an encounter and a response, right? And interestingly, Lenin wrote a lot about testing, but not often like talking about it as a particular pedagogical logic. But if you in particular read his writings and reflections and commentary to the party and other groups throughout the course of 1917, you'll see that like every time the masses take to the streets to challenge and push the boundaries of what exists, Every time political factions put forward their slogans and banners, each time that, one of the provisional government of the Soviets take another step. At each one, the Bolsheviks utilized demonstrations or protests as kind of pre-tests, right, in which they test their slogans, their internal organization, the composition and strength of their allies and enemies, the different classes taken to the streets, right? And so the Bolsheviks embrace the test drive, which means they don't control it, but they subject themselves to it. Because it's really only by submitting to the test drive that, we can have any chance of passing the ultimate test, which is revolution. And this is true also, with the new economic policy implemented when Lenin was speaking to the Bolshevik Central Committee in 1922. Lenin framed the new economic policy as a test or a series of tests, right? And he urged comrades again, right, to embrace the test. We need a real test, he says, right? Something that's going to test the durability of our revolution, the strength of our party, the strength of the people. Either we pass it in competition with private capital, or we fail completely, right? So even once they have state power, they still can't predict or control the outcome of the test. So they continue to subject themselves to the test. And this is why revolutions are, ongoing processes, and so dynamic and, defined by fits and starts and, defeats and advances, and so on and so forth. So, I just kind of offer that as and I'm also not saying that the party or political pedagogues must be in a party, obviously. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that for political education, right, it's important that the pedagogue have an understanding of the current conjuncture so that they can navigate those things. And it seems like, Jason, based on what you said, that's what you're doing in that instance, right? Because I also don't think that learning, can only tethers us to capital, for example. Right. The problem is that learning dominates totally at the expense of studying. Right. That's really my issue. And I think that, just in response to Kym, I'll say that I think that this is actually why the People's Forum, ISKRA, Hampton Institute, all these places are so important, is just because we need to be speaking to the people, and we need to position activists and organizers as intellectuals. Right. And because that's, there's always a theorizing that happens in the movement, right? And in my own experience, I've learned way more in political organizations than I learned in my PhD programs, easily, the 6 months in a political organization is better education than, a PhD program. So yeah, I just appreciate that. And I appreciated your, take on the poetic form of the writing, because that's something that I was trying to do, but I never know. That's not one of my real strengths. So. Anyways, thanks for engaging the text. It really means a lot to me.
Yeah, I think just to echo the speakers, there was something really beautiful about this text, and it's not frequent that I read a book and I'm left with that glowing sort of encounter of the text itself right afterwards. And this is one of those books where I feel like I read it, there's this reverberating fuck yes, and it's like there's something that's it's sort of mysterious about the text too, right? It's a complicated text of educational philosophy, and I think that like Peter McLaren had recently said, it's worthwhile to stick with this text, even though it might be complicated to some readers, but the message is conveyed through the poetics of the text itself. And I just think, yeah, that's not a deep question or statement on my end, but the overall just the general glowing takeaway, I think, was a brilliant aspect of the text.
Nate, and then we can have the other panelists respond.
Awesome. So, Derek, I actually want to ask a question that, we've had come up a bit in the feedback, and I think you've mentioned a little bit about this yourself. And Peter McLaren mentions this in his review posted by the Hampton Institute, that some of the scholars that you utilize would be considered controversial by typical Marxist standards. We can talk about such a thing. I think two that really stand out to me would be Peter Sloterdijk and then Lyotard, obviously. So, they're obviously both postmodernist thinkers, which many Marxists are turned off by that thing immediately. But further than that, when you look at Sloterdijk, he's been accused of fascist leanings following the symposium where he presented rules for the human part. Lyotard's politics, which were really an anti-Soviet Marxism, eventually evolved into a rejection of Marxism as such. So while I think a lot of readers will really be challenged by that, at the same time, I think there's something in the work itself, your emphasis on swerve in the encounter, where that sort of thing is actually absolutely necessary. So while you've hit on this a little bit, my question really just comes down to, could you expand on your method for choosing the scholars from which you base your work? And how would you respond to readers that are intimidated by those specific choices? Scholars from which you base your work, and how would you respond to readers that are intimidated by those specific choices?
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of this was the result of chance encounters. I started studying air conditioning when I was a graduate student because I lived in Syracuse, New York, the headquarters of Carrier, right? And Peter Sloterdijk's written about the air and all that, right? So that's why I engaged that project, and I wanted to read that trilogy, the Spheres trilogy. And I was only going to read it and understand it if I wrote about it, basically, right? And with Lyotard, Lyotard's been actually very dear to my heart since I was I was taught his work by Margaret Grebovich when I was an undergrad several years ago. And yeah, you're right. So Lyotard was part of the Marxist movement, but he was introduced to Marxism through a critique of Marxism, right? Through the Trotskyites, basically, when he was in Algeria. And he was an organizer. And even after he left the official sort of, Fourth International groupings, he still, worked with the National Liberation Front, and also when he was in France, coordinating there. And so, but, what's interesting is that, one, I think that, we should take what we can from what we, it's we don't like capitalism, but it's not like we're going to get rid of, everything capital produced, for example, right? And this is one thing that I find interesting about David Harvey's analysis, his critique of Lenin, which is that Lenin embraced Fordist production, right? As if, but there's nothing sort of inherent in Fordist production that's we can't reappropriate it, recontextualize it, or they turn it, right? And the other thing the thing that's important for me about Sloterdijk is that he shows us how globalization is not new, right? And existed even before the 1800s, right? And the different phases of it. And he calls our attention to the most sort of indisputably shared element, right, of life, which is air, right? That which totally, resists capitalist commodification. You can commodify air, obviously, but you can't, prevent air from one place entering another place 100%. Well, at least if you want life to stay there. And then this idea of lordly imagining that he talks about, which globalization was driven by this imagination that, we can unite the whole world into one sphere, right? Which actually resulted in breaking up the world in all these different spheres. For Lyotard, I think what's most important is how he noted basically capital's flexibility to not only accommodate critique, but actually invite it, right? Capital needs our critiques, it profits from them, right? And this is why I think most literature that just focuses on critique is, it can be good and useful, right? But Gabriel Rockhill gave a talk about this at the People's Forum that you can watch about the global theory industry, and I think his work on this is really important and really great because, it can accommodate some things, right? Can't accommodate everything, and in particular, it doesn't want to tolerate too much revolutionary knowledge production, right? And so that's what's missing in a lot of theoretical work today is as I said, people like to talk about Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The point of philosophy is not just to interpret the world, but to change it. But they never mentioned the direction and how he wanted to change it, which was by establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat and ultimately creating a classless society. So I think that the other thing that Lyotard shows us is how central transparency is to contemporary capitalism, in which basically we're produced as subjects who must constantly express ourselves, right, and articulate our desires and our thoughts. Think about talk shows, or the Maury Povich shows, or social media, right, where, you know, we feel like compelled, like we don't exist as subjects unless we express ourselves and articulate, and all of that produces, you know, inputs for capital's circuits of exchange and production. So that's how I respond to that. Thank you. I would like to see if, I don't know if there's any audience questions, but I'd be curious if any of the panelists wanted to respond or had anything else to add.
I have a question. So just fairly early in the beginning, you kind of talk about the former concerns the content of education, while pedagogy concerns the relation to the content. And so my question, and I was kind of just thinking about this a lot, because pedagogy, to me, in my mind, starts with the learner, right? It starts with the learner. So I'm just thinking through this in the relation to the content, and just thinking from a school, right? You know, I'm, like I said, I'm reading this like as I'm doing all the stuff within the public school system. So I'm just like thinking about this. And so my question is, how do we think about, I guess, as pedagogues, like, how do we think about, or like, what is your take rather, like, on the other forces that, I guess, hinder how a child would relate to the content? Like, you can't tell me that a kid is going to do well in school if he saw his mom's lights are cut off. He can't focus on content. So how do we, I'm thinking, like, I wonder how your theory plays into that, if that made any sense, Derek. Sorry.
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you.
You can't focus on content. So how do we, I wonder how this,
I think that, let me respond to that, but first, let me see if Nazia, Jason want to add anything, respond, anything like that. Please. No? So you're satisfied with my answers? Or, well. So to your question, Kym, very important point. And, you know, oftentimes, I think basically, like, nobody really, like, I mean, yeah. I mean, one, you know, like, I got a PhD in education, like a critical school, and I left, and I basically was like, what the hell is pedagogy? You know, I wrote a book about it, and then I was like, wait, what the hell is pedagogy? Like, you know, we say this word, but we never, like, there's no understanding of what it is, really. So I think that we have to, you know, part of my work is, you know, I mean, I'm not here to tell public school teachers what to do, or, you know, anybody what to do, but really what my work is, at a sort of theoretical level, is to try to generate or build on a conceptual vocabulary that we can share in common, so that we can have a sort of common language with which to engage in pedagogical processes, to reflect on them, to refine them, to experiment with them, to discuss them, evaluate them, you know, and so on and so forth, because we really lack that. And there's always constraints to education, you know, I mean, and there's always constraints to everything, obviously, but, you know, it matters a lot, obviously, if you are, you know, even if you're thinking within the context of a political organization or a political setting, right? Is it like, are the people united by a political program? Do they come from different tendencies? Are they, you know, how experienced are they? How knowledgeable are they? Do they know each other or not? You know, because for sure, I mean, like, you know, basically, like, there's no correlation between knowledge and like how you do on tests, right? Like, I teach Wayne Au's book, Unequal by Design. It's old, but it's still very good. But, you know, at one point in there, he's like, you know, when they did a study of like the changes in test scores at a school, like, none of it had to do with like, you know, studying or teaching. It had to do with like, was there a garbage truck making noise that day outside? You know, like, did the kid have breakfast or not? Right. So I think that's the risk in isolating pedagogy and education, right? But I think it's a necessary sort of risk, because or else we don't think about pedagogy, you know, precisely. And then these are also elements of the conjuncture, right, that determine what pedagogies we use and when, and so on and so forth. Yeah, Jason.
Yeah, so one other thing that strikes me, and it comes up in different places, but I'd be curious to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on this, is the question of teleology. And insofar as the question of teleology, both in education, pedagogy, and in, say, the notion of revolution. And what, yeah, if there's a lot to say about this, but I'm curious what what you would say about it, and then it looks like we have a question from the audience, so I'd love to hear that too.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I mean, one of the ways in which Marx, really radically departs from Hegel in terms of the dialectic is precisely the abandonment of any notion of teleology, right? That there's a sort of finite end towards which things progress, right, in any stages or developmental or even more complex way. And Marx said that there's no general historical philosophical key to understanding every situation. I mean, because that would be anathema to Marxism, really, right? Or in historical materialism. And so really, I think what we find in Marx is our complex understandings of the multiple modes of temporality throughout time and across the world. For example, when he talks about how capital really imposes a kind of, the linear clock time, linear, as what Lefebvre calls linear repetitions over daily life, right? So we think about things in terms of minutes and so on and so forth. But that's an attempted imposition. There's all kinds of other rhythms that we experience and that we live by, right? And of course, there's things that capital can't colonize, right? I mean, this is Jonathan Curry's book from a while ago, 24/7. Like, capital is trying to colonize sleep by making machines that can basically use our dreams as raw materials or whatever, but it can't totally eliminate the need for sleep, right? So, I mean, for me, and based on my reading of Marx, which is also heavily influenced by Althusser, who's basically look at, well, this is the other thing too. I mean, so I say this a lot, but I think it's important. The very first sentence of the first volume of Capital is the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself at first sight as, a bundle of commodities or whatever. And the important thing for me is that the capitalist mode of production prevails, right? It isn't exclusive. Because this is a distinction between social formations and modes of production, right? All social formations have multiple modes of production within them, right? So even in U.S. capitalism, there's still slavery relations, for example, that continue today, right? Feudal relations that continue. And he also wrote about this in one of the prefaces, that England, even where it was the most advanced capitalist country, not only suffers from the evil of capitalism, but also, from other modes of production. And as far as I know, neither Marx nor Lenin ever wrote about a socialist mode of production. They talked about a communist mode of production. So really, socialism is the social formation in which elements of the capitalist and communist modes of production are sort of in battle with each other, right? And there's no predetermined outcome to that, right? I mean, the actuality of revolution doesn't mean it's predetermined or that it's going to succeed, And I think this is important, right? Because there's also a tendency in the history of the communist struggle where there's just constant proclamations that this is the final crisis, this is it, and there's been so much of that I always hesitate about that because that's not how things really work. And how many times have we heard that and capital has actually continued on, right? And there's a question from the audience too about how counterinterpolation might be sparked specifically by sonic encounters and how we might utilize such encounters in the classroom. So I think Nazia, you mentioned this, the difference between hearing and listening that's developed in the chapter with Lyotard's help, where basically hearing is when I am sonically tuned to confirm things that I know already and experience, right? So I hear you. When I say I hear you, it's I understand you, I've translated those sounds into determinate knowledge. Listening is different because listening is poised at the sort of limits of hearing, right? When you're really listening to something, you're not sure what you might hear, right? If you'll hear it all, right? And so I think that under capitalism, basically we're just conditioned to hear things, which is why we don't hear so much of what's around us. I mean, we don't hear, Dominic Petman has this book, Sonic Intimacy, and he closes it by referencing the Aliens movie, with the tagline was in space, no one can hear you scream. And he's well, depending on who you are and what you are in this earth, nobody can hear you scream either, right? Which is why I'm interested in the question of the aesthetics and how is it that we hear certain things and we're trained not to listen for other things and not to hear other things. In terms of the classroom, I mean, I think this is, I think that also hearing dominates, right? In terms of like, I'm looking for students oftentimes to confirm what I'm saying, or I'm listening in order to hear what was in the text, for example. And so, you know, one practice might be to listen to the other elements of the classroom, right? For example, like the labor that goes into it that we can't see, you know, the air conditioning units, for example. And basically, yeah, it's just sort of, it's a different form of openness, a sonic openness that we might be surprised by, right? Because in particular, if we open ourselves up to sort of interruptions sonically, right? What Dominic Petman calls the oral punctum, which is something that sort of pierces the, you know, the hearing. It like, you know, it sort of shocks us or whatever, right? And it can only shock us if we don't expect it, right? And so we have to, and how many social struggles have really been about creating the conditions such that people's oppression and desire for liberation are audible, you know? I mean, that's why public protests and chants are so important. Right, they make those things audible. That's why the 2006 immigrant rights strike was so crucial, right? Because a lot of that in Damayan, New York City, their work is so crucial because a lot of that labor takes place behind closed doors, you know, and so they make that labor visible to us. So I don't know if that 100% answers your question, but I hope it helps. Thank you. Anybody else want to say anything?
Yeah, I've got one final question if we have time for this here. Maybe you can keep the answer super brief or we could always chat about it later. But you've brought this up a couple of times and I just wanted to touch on this with regard to pedagogy. But you made a really fascinating point in the intro to your book. And you've also mentioned this here a little bit. And you talk about the fact of prevailing modes of production within a given society. And so the quote from the book, this is pages 10 through 11 for those who want to follow along. And it's, even capitalism for Marx was not universalizing or totalizing. Marx saw capitalism as housing a vast heterogeneous inventory and conjuncture of temporalities, no longer stigmatized for having been cast out of time, but rather expressions of contratemps, simultaneous non-simultaneities, contemporaneous non-contemporaneities, or uneven times, and Zeitbedräg, times turmoil, times out of joint. So like with regard to this idea of modes of production existing as multiplicities or like overdetermined multiplicities within socioeconomic formations, I'm just sort of curious how you envision sort of like hangers-on from previous pedagogical modes coexisting with communist modes of pedagogy. So, how might your idea of the pedagogy of the encounter subsume, interact, and deal with, or as you mentioned, sublate, modify, and adapt the oftentimes problematic pedagogical elements that are bound to thrive alongside it from previous modes of production. And you talk about this in chapter 2 a little bit as the reclaimed grasping as a pedagogical element, grasping divorced from its colonial acquisitiveness. This might be one way, I think, in which the pedagogical dimension of earlier modes might not only coexist, but maybe hopefully become subsumed and co-opted by a communist pedagogy in which the acquisitive drive itself is banished, but the tools of knowledge acquisition persist. So kind of a long question, but maybe your thoughts on that to take us home here.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. I just read for the first time ever Frederick Jameson's 1984 piece from New Left Review, where he talks about introduces cognitive mapping. And I mean, I was actually blown away because he's like, the crisis in Marxism at the time isn't scientific, right? It's ideological in that it lacks a vision to communicate to people about what an alternative world could look like. And I was shocked when he explicitly said that Cuba and Yugoslavia at the time did have those ideological visions. And so his idea of cognitive mapping is basically, how do we locate ourselves, right, and our political activities within like a complex global system of capitalism, right, that's fragmented and dispersed across space and time, blah blah blah, and that literally exceeds our cognitive and sensory capacities. Like we can't even it would take us all of our lives to like trace the origins of the iPhone, and to figure out like who made what, for example, right? So in that sense, but it also produces some knowledge about where we are, nonetheless, even though it's limited, right? And so I think that what he's doing there is the project is about both like creating knowledge about where we are, but also about experiencing the limits of that knowledge, which then open us up to, you know, potential other ideological visions of the future. I don't know if I would argue that particular pedagogical logics are tied to particular modes of production. I think that in our current conjuncture, learning is the educational motor of capitalism, which is why it wants to eliminate studying and oftentimes eliminate teaching, right? So it's just all about learning, you know, students are learners, right? Universities are like learning centers, blah, blah, blah. Every problem is a problem of learning. And it depends on, you know, again, the struggle as it proceeds, you know. I think that there's opportunities, and it's important for us to seize on them for disinterpellative encounters under capitalism, because we need to experience, right, that the world can be radically transformed and that it already is radically different. It already houses these vast temporalities, you know, these other things that we can't hear and can't see, or because we're taught not to, we can't feel. And so when we open ourselves up to that, we can really sense the actuality of revolution. It's like, oh, you know what? Yeah, the world is way different than I know it, than I've been taught it is, really. And so therefore, you know, it already is different, right? And so therefore it can be even more different, right? Capitalism isn't eternal, or, you know, even capitalism isn't, you know, sort of, it's dominant, right? But it's not exclusive in that. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, all right, friends and comrades, I think we're getting close to our time here. Just from our end at Iskra Books, thank you, everybody, all of the listeners and watchers. Thank you so much for joining us. Kate, thank you again so much, and People's Forum and 1804 Books. Thank you to all the panelists so much for joining us. It really, from our end, this is one of the best books we've ever published. It's our favorite. We love it. You know, fantastic work, Derek. Yeah, just all good stuff.
Yeah, again, thank you from 1804. The People's Forum is a really exciting discussion to bring about, you know, how we transform ourselves as students, make ourselves open to the world, all of the experiences already has to offer us, and learn from it and transform it in our struggles. Yeah, I don't know, a lot of love from the comments as well, but saying all of you a good afternoon, night, wherever you are. Thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you.